And now we'd love to pass it to Medea Benjamin there in Washington, D.C. to kick us off for day 3 of No War 2024.
Well, good morning to the people here and in different time zones. It's great to be together over Zoom as well as physically, and an exciting 3 days of what is really a global conference spanning the globe from Australia, Germany, and Colombia. And here we are in the heart of the empire today. For those of you on Zoom who don't have the agenda in front of you, I just want to quickly go over it. That after the opening remarks and some what I'm sure will be wonderful poetry, we will have our first session, Mapping Out the Empire, Socioeconomic Costs of Bases, then a short break, followed at 3 p.m. DC time. The second panel, Toxic Impacts of Empire, Linking Environmental Justice and Anti-War Movements. And an hour and 15 minutes after that, we will have closing words by the fabulous World Beyond War Board President, Kathy Kelly. And those of us here will have a time for networking. So first, I want to thank the World Beyond War, both staff and volunteers, for setting up something so daunting as a 3-day conference on 3 different continents. And I also want to put it in the context of what is happening at the United Nations, where we just saw a few days ago a vote about Israel and its occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza by an overwhelming support of 124 to 14, saying that these occupied territories were unlawful, that Israel must withdraw its military forces, that Israel must evacuate all the settlers within 1 year, and that all countries must cease providing weapons that are supporting this occupation. Well, despite this resolutions by the International Court of Justice, we see that not only does Israel keep up its slaughter, but the United States refuses this international call to stop sending weapons. On the contrary, it has just made a new deal with Israel to transfer $20 billion worth of weapons in the coming years to ensure that no matter who is in the White House, the US will continue to support Israel. We also know that the US has bases all around the Middle East that are designed to support Israel, especially in any kind of regional war. And Israel is itching for a war that goes beyond Lebanon and will engage the US in what would be a horrific war with Iran. But we also know that those US bases put US soldiers at risk. And if for nothing else but caring about the lives of US soldiers, we should be calling for the closing of the US bases throughout the Middle East and of course, throughout the world. You can clap for that. So this talks about the importance of the discussion and the work of World Beyond War, because let's face it, here in the United States, this is not going to change with elections. And unfortunately, it's not going to change with resolutions and other efforts by UN bodies. We just heard the Secretary General of the United Nations this morning on CNN, Fareed Zakaria's program, say that the institutions that were set up 80 years ago to deal with the issue of how to live in a world of peace are absolutely outdated, unfair, and ineffective. And so while many of us are struggling to change these outdated, ineffective institutions, we also realize that the change is going to come from the grassroots. It's going to come from global uprisings, some of them already happening around the world. And we know the need to link these together. And that is why this conference is so important, to be part of this web to entrap the military industrial complex and its tentacles, and to start creating the foundations and the vision for what we all want to live in, which is a world beyond war. So thank you once again to the conference organizers. And I'm also delighted that we're opening this conference with poetry, because as we move towards a world we want to live in, that world is full of art and music and
she is an African-American poet, performer, and educator based here in Washington, D.C. As the former D.C. Youth Poet Laureate, she is a 7-time National Poetry Slam Master. Her work has been featured throughout U.S. media, including the Washington Post, NPR, NBC News, and more. In 2020, her writing was honored by the National Youth Arts Foundation.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Medea. We're not seeing your video anymore, and the audio quality has something's happened to it. Can't hear you very well.
oh,
That's much better. We're back to what it was.
yeah.
Can you repeat the introduction, please? Thank you.
Well, I'll start in 2020. Marjan's writing was honored by the National Youth Arts Foundation and was nominated for the U.S. Presidential Scholar in the Arts Award. Her first chapbook, Bloodline, was released and sold out shortly after. Her poetry is now featured in curricula, including Fairfax County Public Schools, Bryant University, the University of Virginia, the University of Wisconsin. As an educator, she has facilitated writing workshops and crafted curriculum across the nation. She is the founder of the Washington International Academy Library and now works to establish libraries across the US as a student at the University of Virginia. Thank you so much, and let's give a warm welcome to Marjan.
You. Can we also get a beautiful warm welcome of applause for our brilliant MC? I realize I may be speaking a little fast, so let's get on the same path. Can I hear you say peace, love, poetry, peace, love, family, peace, love, family. And now we're all here together in peace, love, and as a family. My name is Marjan Naderi. I am so honored to be here with you all, these beautiful faces, and for having me online. I want to say thank you to Greta for working so hard to get me here and for being in communication with me. Yes, I see the applause in the back for Greta. I'm reading... I'm reading a couple poems for you all. My family is from Afghanistan. The war is ongoing. My family continues to be involved in the war. And it's very close to my heart. It's a bit odd because I live in the United States. My father made his living working for the US government. So a lot of my identity is entangled in loving being American and the experiences that I have here, but also recognizing that the wealth that I'm living in is coming from a very dark place. And a lot of that looks like the war in my country. So I write these poems in hopes to reconcile those two. To begin my poems for you, I offer a piece about my favorite dish, kabuli palau. with salt and pepper hair. My mother teaches me to taste my words before I spit them out. Her tongue seasoned spicier than her kebabs. Her hands only know the language of making mantou off her mother's menu. So heritage runs down the throat and into the bloodline. Her favorite home is the kitchen, where the sun melts good morning through blindfolds and hands are already at work. She taught me lessons while cooking qabli palau, gave me the recipe as she said, before you wash your hands, make wudu. Watch sins run down the drain so they don't end up in our family's food, and only make wudu with river water. Only then will Zemzem drip down the elbows for 10 cups of holy water. The ocean on your tongue is a language. Break the rocks in its path for 2 tablespoons of sea salt. Straighten your spine when you stand in the name of your Lord. If they tug, you pull on the roots of Arajan's strength for 4 carats. Bent elbows and bent knees with nothing but a prayer in pocket. Push, picked and plucked, grapes of survival from vines, strangling a future worth striving for. Dry up the bittersweet taste of toil for a cup of raisins. Join all ingredients together for 2 hours. With the stories of my ancestors folded in the creases of my mother's palms, she holds this plate of qabli palau, fresh off the stove. Steam opening her pores tells me this mountain with the brown rice and glistening carrots and raisins at its peak echoes my fingerprints into the soil of Afghanistan. And there is something so emulsifying about a table of food making history seem so easy to touch, to taste. Bismillah. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. I love my mother. I love my mother. Her energy is what I always want to open up a show with. And the food of our country carries so much history and meaning. For a lot of us children of the diaspora and refugees, the way that we hold on to our culture and the way that we resist is through art and through cooking and through writing poems and through living in the mother tongue and thinking in the mother tongue. This is how we resist war. And we see that beautiful struggle in the Palestinian people and the Afghan people and the Ukrainian people. And I think it also gives us the time to rethink through art what pain and war can look like. And so I wrote this next poem after the brilliant writer Danez Smith. It's entitled An Alternate Heaven for Refugees. In an alternate heaven for refugees, my people no longer kiss their ears to soil, hoping to hear the hums of an ancestry that lived. Here, power does not twist our tongues and tie them around our throats. But I can't rewrite history the way they did. No, America knows what they did. How they stole our stories of freedom and bravery and claimed it as their own. But here, America can't stain our white thobes ruby red, because here, There are no borders. Do not call us dead. Call us alive, because now we have the right to exist anywhere, whether we call it home or mosque or church or synagogue or human love. If it grows here, it knows its place in history. If you're born here, the land will love you back. In this heaven, we whisper our own names in prayer. A law rewinds every bullet. All the boys win the soccer match, and trophies get washed up on seashores instead of the bodies of children who knew how to swim but couldn't. But there, missiles banged like an orchestra singing forgotten names. There, oppression became muscle memory. There, I learned to count the dead and multiply body counts by the hour. My younger brother cried a prayer over my dead body every time he saw a piece of me disintegrate. But brother, I wasn't there. I was here. Here. Rather than throwing rocks at rivers, we toss rocks into soldiers to watch the ripplings of recovery feed every thirsty body here. My mother's Yemeni grace pours upon me. My father's laugh lives in the olive trees of Palestine. Sockets of hope grow from Syrian soil here. I chant the Somali anthem and hear the winds sing it back. Lullabies that were once missiles are now my sister's voice, echoing in the mountains of Afghanistan. I earned this paradise by a death I did not deserve, because someone, somewhere, prayed the pieces of our ancestry would rest in peace. I wrote that poem and I wanted to share it with you all today because I've noticed that with victims of war, especially back home in Afghanistan, many of the people are truly fearless and they carry a contentment, a certainty that there is life beyond their material world. And they exist in a peace that I envy and that I see so many survivors of war carry. And so I wanted to write that poem as an offering to all of us that grieve the lives that have been lost, but imagining them as watchers, as witnesses. This next poem I'm going to read is a bit more about the connection of being an Afghan and American. It's a bit more political. I wrote it in the slam world after Donald Trump declared his Muslim travel ban. So I hope you all can sit back and buckle in and enjoy. With legs crossed, Baba and I sit near the sea, hands cusped onto waves holding memories of back home, washing onto this side of the world. He tells me he let go of a country we could have known. At first glance, a small village in the depth of Afghanistan doesn't sound like much of a sacrifice, but it was. There, where he molded life within those walls and beyond them, the comfort of blending in. Do you think if America told him it was not a promise, he would have sacrificed the only place he ever loved for a shot in the dark to grant us safety? But where is safety? Any place the sun sets, Shadows of martyrs follow in Baba's silhouette, a loud stillness being wrung by fists holding memories that haunt. We left a country swallowed by bullets, this country an exit wound, his anger a battle manifesting within him, heart playing like war drums rattling rooftops, trumpets blaring death, he warned me. Every funeral was singing, "Come to America." And here we are, trying to make home out of walls that go, foreigner, outsider, trying to make a life from a dream so far from reach it can only be held in slumber. Wave a flag with red stripes, still as bloody bodies, white lies between them, selling a narrative only stars can make sparkle. She has a tendency to snatch and claim things as hers, and when they no longer serve as purposeful, she's master at making men disposable. America, you, cigarette butt left burning, placed next to all things flammable. Maybe we wouldn't be seeking refuge, forcing our tongues to recite her pledge of allegiance, had she not meddled in the growth of our homelands. Had she just let them grow. Baba, how many American dreamer stories are left untold because they couldn't make it across the sea? Baba, how many stories have sunk, hitting rock bottom, never washing onto this side of the world, never floating to the surface for the world to grieve? Thank you. So much.
Thank you. That was so beautiful and moving and amazing, the line that you walk between honoring and loving the ancestry, the place of your grandparents, and recognizing what it is here in the United States for so many people who have left their homes to come here with a vague idea of the American dream. And especially now when we're in this election season, where the issues of immigration are being used to say who will be the hardest on immigrants, who will be more hateful towards the immigrants, who will close our borders more than the other. And when they talk about getting to the root of the problem, they never talk about the US wars all over the world. But that's something that this group really understands. And thank you so much for setting that deep, deep, deep emotional connection that we need as we move into more of the deep understanding of what the US military is doing around the world. In our first session, and that is the session entitled Mapping Out the Empire Socioeconomic Costs of Bases. And it will be moderated by Jessica Sun, a member of the leadership team of the Pax Christi Young Adult Caucus. So please come up and give a hand to Marjan for the incredible poetry that she gifted to us.
All right, welcome everyone to our first session of the day. So we welcome our Zoom attendees, Thanksgiving for the World Beyond War leadership team and everyone who is joining us
Gracias a todas las personas que se están uniendo.
The land acknowledgement. We are here in Washington, D.C., and we are sitting on the occupied ancestral lands of the Anacostans and our neighbors of the occupied ancestral lands of the Piscataway people. We are about to enter into our first session on mapping out empire, the socioeconomic costs of bases. After traveling the globe and exploring the impacts of US military bases in different regions of the world, we conclude the conference in Washington, D.C., the heart of the empire. In this session, we will map out the extent of the empire using World Beyond War's bases mapping tool and the local and global impacts of these bases. World Beyond War's co-founder and executive director, David Swanson, and Dr. Cynthia Enlow, who is the author of Bananas, Beaches, and Bases. Dr. Cynthia will be joining us via Zoom. And our third panelist, Curie Peterson-Smith, unfortunately was not able to join today due to a death in the family. This session is sponsored by Dr. Michael D. Knox and the U.S. Peace Memorial Foundation. And we thank them for their sponsorship and want to give Michael a chance to unmute and maybe say a few quick words on Zoom.
Am I unmuted?
Yes.
So hello, everyone, and thank you, Jessica. I'm so happy to help out with this important conference. If I could say a few words about the U.S. Peace Memorial Foundation. We're a 501c3 not-for-profit founded in 2005. We have 3 projects that we're involved in. One is the U.S. Peace Registry, where we document the important work of people who speak out against war in the United States. You know, in our country, part of maintaining the culture of war is that we honor the soldiers and the warriors all the time. And in my little town, there are 4 big monuments to soldiers right in the major cross section, but nothing about peace. And certainly in Washington, D.C., a lot of emphasis on honoring the soldiers. So we want to bring the peacemakers to the forefront, and the U.S. Peace Registry is a project where we honor hundreds of American peacemakers and organizations. And at this meeting so far, I've seen 8 or 9 of them: David Hartsaw, Alice Slater, Gar Smith, Scott Camel, Beverly Lowenstein, John Pegg, Phil Anderson, and of course, Greta Zaro are all listed in the U.S. Peace Registry, which you can look at uspeacememorial.org. The second project, from these outstanding anti-war heroes, we select every year someone to receive the U.S. Peace Prize. We've done that for 16 years, and I'm so honored to be in the presence of 3 of those recipients who are here today. Of course, the Honorable Medea Benjamin is a U.S. Peace Prize recipient. The Honorable Kathy Kelly, who will be closing out the conference, is a Peace Prize recipient. And of course, sitting at the table there, the Honorable David Swanson. In previous years, Code Pink, Veterans for Peace, and World Beyond War have also been awarded this prestigious award. The third project, I'll be quick here, is just to build a physical monument, the U.S. Peace Memorial in Washington, D.C., to honor these individuals and organizations and to make it clear to Americans that it's socially acceptable to speak out against war. And we know there are consequences right now in our culture to doing that, but we hope that people will be more likely to do so if they see quotations from famous Americans who they know, like Helen Keller and Margaret Mead, Dr. Martin Luther King, people in our history whose names they know but are shocked by the strong anti-war quotations on the monument. So I hope you'll look at uspeacememorial.org, consider joining us. We have over 800 founding members and honorees, and I hope you'll learn more about us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Knox. And I will go right into introducing our two panelists today. First is David Swanson, a co-founder, executive director, and a board member of World Beyond War. He is based in Virginia in the United States. David is an author, activist, journalist, and radio host. He is campaign coordinator for rootsaction.org. Swanson's books include War is a Lie. He blogs at davidswanson.org and warisacrime.org and hosts Talk World Radio. He is a Nobel Peace Prize nominee and was awarded the 2018 Peace Prize by the U.S. Peace Memorial Foundation. Cynthia Enloe is a research professor in the Department of Sustainability and Social Justice at Clark University and is affiliated with Clark's Women and Gender Studies and Political Science programs. Cynthia Enloe's career has included Fulbrights in Malaysia and Guyana, guest professorships in Japan, Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand, and Iceland, as well as the Middlebrook Gerasi Visiting Professor of Gender Studies at University of Cambridge, UK. She has presented lectures in countries throughout the world, and her writings have been translated into a multitude of languages. She has published in Miss Magazine and The Village Voice and appeared on National Public Radio, Al Jazeera, C-SPAN, and the BBC. Her newest book is The 12 Feminist Lessons of War. And with that, I'll hand it over to David to take it away.
Thank you. It's working? Okay. Thank you so much. I've got a slideshow. Before we get to that, let me thank a few people. First of all, Jessica, thank you very much for that. And I think we all wish Curry the best and are sorry he's not here. I'm looking very much forward to learning a lot from Cynthia. I do think that if there's anything this town could use, it is a monument or a memorial for peace. There's just about a monument to every war and just about every spare inch of space taken up by monuments to war. I think maybe the one closest to us where we sit here, some of us, is to World War I of all absurdities. You know, enough. We need to change what we honor. Thank you to everybody online for being here. Thank you to Greta and Rachel and to everyone. And thank you to Medea for wonderful opening remarks today. Absolutely incredible that the Secretary General of the United Nations would say how outdated and insufficient our institutions are when many well-meaning nonprofit organizations won't say it. You know, we need desperately to reform or replace these institutions where some parties are far more equal than others, and anything decent can be vetoed and threats and bribes rule the day. I wanted to add that supposedly we're going to see a measure to stop these weapons to Israel from Senator Bernie Sanders with no hurry whatsoever, and maybe they'll vote on it after the U.S. elections, because everybody knows you shouldn't tell anyone what you stand for before an election. What would be democratic about that? So tell these people who pretend to be a government down the street here to vote no and to vote immediately. Also in the House of Representatives, not just the Senate. Now, immediately. I want to go to my slideshow, to slide one, but I wish that Marjan could read my remarks. I think they would be far more powerful. And as a graduate of Fairfax County Public Schools and the University of Virginia, to know that they're teaching her poetry. This is the best thing I've ever heard of either of those institutions. And I think an alternative heaven for refugees is exactly what we're after. For refugees and for world citizens, for people who don't give a damn about nations and their damn militaries, but who care about their communities and their families and the world and everybody in it. Here on Earth, not some other place, we need an alternative. This is what World Beyond War is about. I hope this is slide one. I think it is. So we have heard a lot over the past few days about the damage that foreign bases do and the good work that people do to prevent them or to close them. World Beyond War works with our chapters, our affiliates, our friends around the world on campaigns against these bases. And we work globally to provide resources to people's campaigns. The headquarters for getting informed and getting involved is WorldBeyondWar.org/bases. The leader of our closed bases work is our board member, Robert Fantina. So one resource that you will see soon that you can find on the website at WorldBeyondWar.org/bases is called Military Empires, a visual guide to foreign bases. And one thing you can do with it is spin the globe around and click on a particular one of what are currently 917 US bases outside the United States. And when you do, the map will zoom into a satellite image of the base and provide information and links about the base and the damage it does and who is doing what to get it shut down or converted into something useful, and the land cleaned up and put to better use and possibly restored to those from whom it was stolen. As only a small percentage of people in the United States know or care to find out, US bases are on land stolen from Hawaiians, Aleutian Islanders, the people of several Pacific atolls, Okinawans, Inuits, Chagosians, Koreans, Palestinians. And until those bases were closed, the people of Vieques and Culebra, which we heard about yesterday, among others. Of course, we are constantly updating our maps and depend on help from all of you for updates and corrections. The research for these maps is put together by Mohammed Abunahel, and the maps are created by Mark Elliott Stein. Slide 3, please. Another resource you will find is called Mapping Militarism, a collection of maps of all things militaristic that includes, among much else, a map that color codes countries based on how many US military bases they have. Clicking on each country gives you the details. Another map gives you the number of US troops present. Other maps display NATO members and partners, where US wars have been waged, where the US government is applying sanctions, etc. Together, these maps paint a picture that can be of nothing other than an empire, very poorly understood by most of the people who pay for it. Slide 4, please. You will also find a series of links to particular campaigns. That's slide 3, right? Well, slide 4, when you can. You will also find a series of links to particular campaigns that some of our chapters are working on to close or to prevent particular bases, and to the successful campaign to prevent the construction of a military training ground in Sinyevina, which you know all about if you have been participating in this conference. We hope to work with all interested parties to add more campaigns. Slide 5, please.
David,
When
we've
you
got the slides
examine-
pulled up now on our end. So, Patrick, if you want to shift your camera to show us David's face, then we'll be able to see him now. And hopefully you're seeing Rachel's slides on your end.
Are we good? When you examine the 917 US foreign bases, I think you will come to the following conclusion. These things are catastrophic. They heighten tension, They facilitate wars. They encourage militarism. They provoke terrorism. They endanger host countries. They proliferate nuclear weapons and weapons in general. They support repressive governments. They cause irreparable environmental damage. They cause pollution. We will hear a bit about some of that shortly. They cost an exorbitant amount of money. They deny land to indigenous populations. They cause economic problems for so-called host countries. They station troops who commit crimes and who are given immunity for those crimes. They give a foreign nation influence. They establish mini apartheid states. This is something I've been thinking about since reading the terrific books by David Vine. I don't think anyone has ever done a serious study of it, but I cannot imagine that there is no impact on how US occupiers of these foreign bases think and act when back in the United States, given that many of these bases employ different looking and speaking local residents to do menial jobs on the bases while living off the bases with a very different social, economic, and legal status. Slide 6, please. When you click on a particular base, you get more information about it. For those where we have been able to document the information, these bases tend to be very unpopular locally. Even in that minority of places where people fear some other empire might replace the US empire, their desire is most commonly to be subject to no empires at all. Needless to say, virtually no one in the United States or even the US government could, without consulting our website, tell you where all the bases are. The US public has never been asked to vote on the general idea or on any particular basis. If there were suddenly 916 instead of 917, exactly nobody would care. Leftists who want to invest in peace and climate and healthcare and housing oppose this madness. Right-wingers who want to pretend that the world outside the United States doesn't exist, or who oppose spending money on anything, regardless of its merits or lack thereof, oppose it too. Even top officials within the US military itself believe that technology has rendered this empire of bases, or much of it, pointless for the project of being able to quickly wage war anywhere on Earth. And yet the bases persist and even expand as tools of imposing power, influencing governments, selling weapons, justifying militaries and alliances like NATO, not to mention providing lovely destinations with many golf courses and restaurants where occupiers can rule over the lower class locals, feel superior, and build hatred and resentment toward the United States of America. Slide 7, please. While no other nations have anything like the 917 foreign bases that the United States has, the UK does have 117, so only 800 more to catch up. India has 22, Turkey has 128 in just 10 countries, France has 15 in 10 countries. These are all close US allies and weapons customers. Russia has 58 foreign bases in 10 countries. Syria and Djibouti being the farthest from Russia. We have created map tools similar to the US one for each of these countries so that you can spin the globe and zoom in on each of their bases. Slide 8, please. Another 12 countries have tiny numbers of foreign bases. In some cases, their only base is in Djibouti, a small nation that seems to have gone out of its way to rent out bases to every possible foreign government for the financial gain of the brutal Djibouti government, but not the people of Djibouti, and certainly not the people of the wider world, which is put at risk of a conflict being sparked by countries like the United States and China having bases in the same place. The key point to make here is that it is really, really weird to have foreign military bases. Most countries on Earth do not do it at all. Some do it a tiny bit. It is basically a US thing, and there is no evidence of any benefit. Bases are part of a global war machine that is dominated by the United States. In the latest numbers on military spending of 230 other countries, the US spends more than 227 of them combined. Russia and China spend a combined 21% of what the US and its allies spend on war. Since 1945, the US military has acted in a major or minor way in 74 other nations. Of 230 other countries, the US exports more weaponry than 228 of them combined. Most places with wars manufacture no weapons. Most wars have US weapons on both sides. The US is the leading exporter of weapons to each and every type of government, including the very worst. If bases reduced wars or militarism, this picture would be very different. Slide 9, please. Last slide. On the same webpage as the links to each nation's base map is a link to a map of foreign bases that have been closed, such as Vieques, which you know about if you've been part of this conference. Closed doesn't necessarily mean cleaned of toxins, poisons, unexploded bombs, and mines. Closed doesn't necessarily mean the land and water will ever recover. But closed is a start. Where we've been able to gather the information, we have included with each base who managed to get it closed, when, and how. The people who do this work need to be honored and thanked for their service. Bases are closed as a result of public pressure, but also as a result of military coups and shifts in military strategies and various other reasons. We hope that investigating this data will lead to some usable conclusions regarding getting more bases closed more quickly, as well as getting them closed without replacing them with others, and without seeing them reopened when public pressure eases, as we have seen in various locations, such as the Philippines. Of course, it is easier to prevent a base than to close one that's been built. You've heard examples from Czechia and from Sieniewina and from Colombia. It's also possible to win a half victory. In Vicenza, Italy, for example, massive public pressure that many of us were part of resulted in unwanted base construction, but of a smaller base than the US government had sought. We have focused on foreign bases because they do harm that domestic ones do not. But domestic military bases do a world of damage as well. Whether or not we ever manage to map them all for various nations, we are aware of many of their results and are working to get them closed where we can. Most of the worst environmental disaster sites in the United States are the creation of the United States' own so-called Defense Department. More to come on that later today in this room. The lesson I draw from having worked to oppose bases in several countries while based in the Washington, D.C. area, or not too far from it, is that we are stronger when we have solidarity across borders, and in particular, when we are working together both at the location of a base, closed base, and at the location of the heart of the empire here in Washington. A number of times now, I have worked with opponents of U.S. bases in distant corners of the globe and watched as they were asked the inevitable question by U.S. Congress members or staffers, namely, well, if you don't want the base there, then where do you want it? And in each case, to their everlasting credit and praise, these good people have responded, we do not want it anywhere. Thank you all for being here. We are stronger together.
So with that, we'll just go ahead and go into our Q&A or discussion with folks here, and with David, of course. So please come up to the microphone, share a question, or just from where you are, say it out, and I'll repeat it into the mic. So I'll start off. David, could you give us an example or a story of a time of meeting someone you hadn't known before in a different country, and efforts in connecting your work here with theirs, and how that went, like a personal story of someone you knew or know?
Wow, there are many, many. I'm thinking at the moment about Vicenza, Italy, because there was such a wonderful movement there uh, against bases. And it was led by people who had never had anything to do with activism and were doing sort of a NIMBY campaign, not in my backyard. I mean, we don't want it. But who, as I mentioned earlier, took a really principled stand that they didn't want to help the US military figure out somewhere else to put it either, not in their country or any other country. And like the people from Sinyevina, like the people we heard from and about yesterday in Czechia, like the people we spoke with yesterday in Colombia who stopped a proposed base on one island are now trying to stop a proposed base on another island. These were people who were not involved in activism before. In some cases, are still involved in activism now. In some cases, no, they went back to their normal lives. But who, got to know people working against bases around Europe and around the world, and came here to Washington, D.C. to talk to the U.S. State Department and the U.S. Congress members. And it's incredible how engaged and how much work people will put in to help make the world a better place, and how little people in power want to let them. These people find out that the United States military is planning a base literally in their backyard years after their national government and their local government know all about it. There's detailed plans, the construction's about to start before anybody's told. And these are the people who are going to have to live next to the drunk driving and the rapes and the chaos that a military base brings. And they're willing to put in endless hours of research and strategizing ways to make their town a better place rather than a worse place. And governments don't want them doing it. They want them sitting home watching TV, and it's terrific to meet people who in many cases didn't really know how horrible the world can be. And the minute they find out, don't crawl under their bed or whine or moan or come up with some harebrained scheme or believe the fascists have the answers, but get engaged and involved and work, in good directions. And this is part of the benefit of doing this kind of work, is that you meet these kind of people.
Right on. Stronger together. Please, we'll have our first question from Medea.
Yes, David, you said that there are people on the right who also are not in favor of the U.S. spending this kind of money on having these bases overseas. Do you know of any good either individuals or organizations, either libertarian or Republican or however characterized on the right, that are writing or organizing to try to close U.S. military bases?
I don't in the United States. There are, of course, groups across the political spectrum in the locations of U.S. bases, planned or existing, who oppose them and actively work to oppose them. But here in the United States, I don't. I wish I did, and maybe we can do more to get them to. But the libertarian groups that oppose everything, good, bad, or otherwise, oppose bases. And what little polling has ever been done, there isn't any big constituency in the United States that's in favor of having all these foreign bases. And yet most people don't say anything because they're not asked. It's not an issue. It's not in the presidential debates. It's not in the party platforms. It's not in the television ads. It's not in the spam on your phone and your email from the campaigns. It's not on CNN. It just doesn't exist. And but when asked, when told and asked, which is even better, telling people, you know, how many bases and how much they cost and how they make us less, not more safe, nobody wants them. And even just told the US has all these bases and here's what they cost is enough. Almost nobody wants them. And yet it's not hard to find out. I mean, you watch a sports game in the United States and they thank the troops for watching from 175 countries and nobody blinks. You know, it's an open secret. And if people thought they could change things, if people knew, I should say, that they can change things if they put in the work, there would be people across the political spectrum engaged. And, you know, to some extent, there are certainly individuals, but in terms of organizations, I don't know. We got to work on it. Good question. Yeah. If, by the way, if there are questions on Zoom and you want to cut into our line here in the room, you're invited to shout out. Meanwhile,
Thank you.
here in
Yeah,
the
maybe
room,
we
go
can
ahead.
alternate back and forth because we have some questions coming in here as well.
Okay, so we go to you for one, Greta?
Sure. Yeah, I think we have a really great question that just came in from Tom Baker. And also I see Randy has a hand up. We'll get to you later, Randy. But I just want to get to this one from Tom, who says, can you speak about the false argument that having a US base in your country will provide an economic advantage for the locals?
Yes, I mean, it's not completely false in all locations everywhere, right? There are people who make money getting jobs from US bases and selling services and goods to the troops from US bases. But in general, it is false. I mentioned Djibouti making money from bases. Most of these countries lose money on bases. Most of these countries have to fork over money for the privilege of being occupied. And obviously, there are dramatically better alternatives for the amount of money that the United States puts in to creating an armed occupation of your country with people who will be outside of your laws and set up in a structure that makes them almost perforce obnoxiously superior to the people of your country. Any number of alternatives are available. Why, you know, why not create jobs through something other than mass killing? On top of which, you've got this unknowable, unaccountable zone in your territory that's putting toxic pollutions into the groundwater, into the earth, noise pollution, and not to mention plane and helicopter crashes in the sky, and creating a target, right? I mean, all the people we talked to 2 days ago now in Australia about the US bases there. I mean, they're worried about all these problems, but they also don't appreciate being made a prime target for China by the country that's trying to start a global war with China, right? And so what if some people could make some money from a base? Would that be a justification for helping promote the general drain of our resources here and your resources there into the war machine, and the danger that it creates and the hostility that it creates, and all of the other toxic effects of having an occupation, even if it's invited, would it be worth it? This is the same thing you see daily with U.S. Congress members talking about the jobs that the war machine creates. I mean, this has to look sociopathic to the rest of the world. Why should you engage in it? Why should you become a sidekick and a poodle to this empire with the excuse of creating jobs when we know perfectly well that almost anything else creates better jobs without all these damaging toxic side effects to boot? So I don't think it's a good argument, obviously. You want to go next?
Yeah, David, kudos on creating this tool. It's very amazing. I'm curious, how did y'all go about getting all of the information necessary to create this, like where they're all located and even like, the information about which groups are fighting all of these bases, and how are you going to keep this website up to date? And then also, like, how do you envision getting the word out about this, and how do you hope that this ultimately gets used by people who, want to see some of these bases get shut down?
Well, the short answer is with help from you all. The longer answer is that not I, but principally Bob Fantina and Mohammed Abunahel and Mark Elliott Stein, with help from Allison Brunowski and lots of people on our board and staff and chapters and volunteers, have pooled information and searched for news articles. And it's usually bases aren't created in total secret. Nobody, just about nobody in the world or in the United States hears about every particular new base, but there's some local news report where it happens. And there are all kinds of other reports that can be gone through from governments and from news and from social media and from friends and allies that can be pulled together. But it's an endless ongoing process. There are no doubt mistakes already that need to be updated and corrected. And there are endless plans for new bases and bases being discovered that we weren't told about, but they're up and running. The greatest democracy on earth doesn't tell the people who live in it what it's doing, doesn't even tell the people where the bases are being built what it's doing. We have to find out. But like wars, big military bases are hard to keep secret from everybody. If you could, they probably wouldn't do the damage they do. And so it's by having friends and chapters around the world and putting out the word that we want to know if a base closes, if a base opens, if a base expands, if a base changes, or if you start a campaign to prevent a base, that we find out. And so, a lot of times people come to us, thank goodness, because they hear that we're looking to help and say, hey, we're trying to prevent this base. In other cases, we find out that they've begun a campaign to prevent a new base on a new island in Colombia or somewhere else. And we say, hey, we want to help. But it's, I wish there's not one other website that's the single answer that I can send you to. If there were, we wouldn't have needed this one, but it's just searching everywhere we can, and putting the word out in every way we can that we want people to use this tool and we want to help them use it. Should we go to you, Greta?
Sure. We see Randy from Sacramento has patiently had a hand up. And Randy, we've seen you all 3 days of the conference, so thanks for sticking around this whole weekend. We'd love to hear your question.
Okay, thank you very much. I live in California, and they closed their Air Force base here. It's not the same out there anymore. It's very empty. There are a lot of stores that are no longer open down there. They got some civilian jobs down there. The other thing is when they closed another Air Force base in California, they left a lot of toxicity around, and none of that land was able to use anymore, so they couldn't convert it to anything. So I guess my question is, what do you believe about the toxicity level that are left at bases that are closed? Who's going to be responsible for that? And who's going to help shore up those jobs that are going to be lost, that were lost at Mazer Air Force Base?
I think I caught most of that, Randy. Thanks for the question. Wonderful place, California. I was there last week, and we're going to have a panel here in this room later today with Pat Elder, among others, who are going to speak to the environmental destruction of U.S. bases and may have some good answers for you. But obviously, the United States government is responsible and needs to be held responsible by the people of the United States, who have tools to do that the people of many nations occupied by U.S. bases don't. They aren't even allowed to know what U.S. bases are doing to their water and their soil and so forth. But we need to move money from building more bases to cleaning up the disasters created by the old bases. And this has to be a priority here in this town, nationally in the United States, as well as for the government of California or local governments there, because it's the U.S. military that's done this. Is it, is it going to get cleaned up? It depends on how much hell we can raise to demand it. But the general answer to the question of what are we going to do about jobs lost when a military operation is shut down is that, of course, we can have more jobs and better paying jobs through any other kind of spending. And we need to do that kind of transition. And we've known how to do it for many decades. And there was a good bill to get it done in Congress that died when Kennedy died. Not the current Kennedy, the one who was president. And during COVID, you saw it done. You saw the U.S. government go to weapons factories and say, hey, switch to making these medical supplies that we need. And it was smooth and it was easy and it didn't cost a fortune. And there is so much money wasted in the destruction of militarism that absolutely every person impacted can be given training and education and relocation and jobs, and nobody needs to suffer in the least in the transition away from militarism. But it has to be done. Just saying that isn't enough. And the U.S. government needs to be made to do it. Hope that helps. If anybody else in the room or online wants to help answer these questions, since I'm like speaking for three panelists here, they should feel free. But let's go to the next person here in the room.
Hi, I wanted to answer Medea's question about, I know within the right-wing movement, there are a lot of people who are against the militarism. And specifically also, there's a lot of alternative youth channels, like We Are Change. I'm thinking of Redacted. Those are two channels that I can think of that are definitely against all the military adventures, and they could become an ally of you, and they would probably be categorized as right wing. There's also anarchist groups like Anarchapulco, and I know there's a lot more that I look at that I could, start accumulating and sending you a list. But there are a lot of right wing organizations that are not officially right wing organizations, but that might be categorized as that, but are very anti-military.
Okay, thank you. Want to go online to you, Greta?
Sure. We have a question from Yuri from Belgium, and this actually is directed to both Medea and David. Yuri says the first day of the conference was in Australia, and he was delighted to see Indigenous voices were featured. And he wants to ask, in the U.S. peace movement / the movement on the left, is it doing enough to have Indigenous Americans be part of this movement, and what will it take for more solidarity given the connections between militarism, racism, classism, materialism, etc.?
It's a great question. If Medea wants to help answer it, she's welcome to take that microphone or to come up here. And if anyone else wants to speak to it, they can shout out. But obviously, we're never doing enough on anything. We need to do dramatically more. But there have been connections made between indigenous groups here in the United States and in Canada, and general anti-war groups, peace groups in Canada. I think Rachel, who's online with us here, can speak to the work that peace groups have done to support indigenous groups against the militarized police takeover of their lands for resources with which to further destroy our planet. I know in my town, in Charlottesville, which is known to some people as the place where a bunch of Nazis came several years ago, among the horrific monuments that we got taken down, which was what was upsetting the Nazis, were some dehumanizing monuments, literally glorifying genocide, depicting the slaughter of Native Americans, which, you know, actually more than one monument.
One area where we see tremendous connection in the peace movement and the indigenous movement in the United States is around Gaza. Oh, it looks like we lost again.
We still get your audio, Medea.
Okay. The framing of the issue in Gaza as, well, in all of Israel, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, as the creation of Israel as a settler colonial project has really resonated with the indigenous community here. And we see dozens of indigenous groups that have not only put out statements, but have been organizing protests and have really been on the front lines in a lot of the growing movement in the United States against the Israeli policies. Thank you.
I've lost track of where we should go. I think online.
One in the room.
In the room? Okay, go ahead,
All right,
Diane.
Thank you. I think it would be helpful to have some some clear descriptive messaging, but I have a question and then related. Is there, if we could say like the total number of what we spend on 917 bases a year, like they could have an image in people's heads? And then also regarding like employment and all of that, like, you know, we've been talking about conversion for decades and nuclear, and, you know, we used to say, you know, what for one person working in the nuclear industry, we could hire like X number of people. And for each person that we send to a military base, you know, we're paying to send them, you know, for transportation, that maybe for each them we could hire X number of people here, or just have some messaging that that people can really understand. And, you know, maybe like Bernie Sanders, or if Dennis Kucinich wins the election, like people could bring that up in Congress.
Yeah, we should do a better job of figuring out exactly what these bases cost. You have to, well, I'll continue, but I think this gentleman is eager to say something. We got to use the microphone.
Question: Brown University's cost of war program goes over the total amounts that we spend on the military and the alternatives that we could have. So I just wanted to comment that. Have you been familiar with Brown University?
Yes, of course.
I think that's a great tool that you could use.
Yeah.
So the comment was that the costs of war project at Brown University is a useful tool, which is true. And
one more thing to add. A few weeks ago, there was a conference with Bill Hartung and some other people about environment and conversion. that was very good. And, maybe people like money for life and not for death. Simple message.
We are all in support of money for life and not for death, and of conversion and of environmental protection. The Costs of War project is very, very useful. They have
Well, if anyone can hear me, maybe in this room they can. Obviously, it's complicated to say what the cost to have all these phases because much of it is secret, because there's the cost of building and maintaining the things, and because a bunch of the money is taken out of the so-called host governments, and because the cost of all the
ships and planes that visit there and of all the troops that go there and then leave again has to be figured out and taken as a portion of the cost of all these troops or the cost of this ship, et cetera. So it's not a simple thing, even if they wanted to tell us, and they don't. But it's obviously vastly more money than anything else anyone ever dreams of the U.S. government spending money on costs. It's, it's over 100, if not hundreds of billions of dollars a year for this madness. And you can obviously take the cost of a doctor or a teacher or whatever you like, as again, the National Priorities Project gives you a tool to do this, and draw the comparison. One reason I'm not super fond of that is because I think it's stupid and evil and counterproductive to say what I used to have shirts that said, bring our war dollars home. It's stupid because war dollars are so many dollars that you could transform the whole damn planet for the better at home and everybody else's home too. You don't have to choose. And it's evil because it sounds so selfish. Like we don't want to have anything to do with the world. We want our money. Whereas you could, triple, quadruple, quintuple actual foreign aid, actual aid, not weapons that are called aid, for a little fraction of what we spend on this military madness, and still transform the United States with, a chunk of the money. So anyway, it's, the money is a big part of it. And the lives that are lost and the lives that are impoverished by not spending the money on something useful is the most damage done. But these spaces are a particular evil that do particular damages by their nature as well. Should we try another person?
Yeah, so
Two more questions, I'm told.
really appreciate what you guys are doing. And I'm just going to start by just saying I'm a podcaster with a very small audience. And the reason I bring that up is because my audience is mostly people who would certainly call themselves progressive Democrats. And no matter how much I point out, and I think with very good evidence, very powerful talking points, how destructive this unitary party that we have is, how the pro-war Democrats and Republicans are destroying the plan, how we don't have the luxury to keep electing the same people from the same parties over and over again. That message is almost invariably, by most of my small audience, rejected because of their terrifying fear of Trump. And those few Trump voters that we have hate Democrats with such passion that they will not even consider voting for a candidate that they have been repeatedly told will help the candidate that they find most objectionable. So my question is more, how do we build a movement that will, in fact, overcome the incredibly loud megaphone that the corporate media, the military, both parties, the billionaire class all have, that is designed to keep a system that is killing us all, destroying our planet, and burning us up? How do we somehow build a movement to stop that?
David,
Well,
could you
I
please
don't,
just quickly summarize the question? Some
nice.
people on Zoom were having a hard time hearing.
I think you said, can I repeat the question? If so, the question was about US politics and US partisan identity and hatred of people with the other identity, and how do you build a movement in that situation, et cetera, which I'm not going to speak to in terms of telling anybody whether to vote or where to vote or who to vote for, in part because I'm speaking largely to people not in the United States, and in part because the US government sets up a structure for nonprofit organizations, as far as I know, unique in the world, that forbids me from doing such things. But I will,
Then, because other countries face the same exact dilemma. For example,
I know.
The French had the situation where
We can't hear the person speaking.
or
Please
do we
get closer
vote
to the mic.
for, do
Thank
we
you.
vote in France for Macron, or do we vote for the fascist Le Pen? Both are equally loathsome.
I know.
Same in England with the Labour versus the Tories. So it's a universal, or not universal, but it's a problem that many other countries face.
So as I was about to say, and as a gentleman just said, this does apply to numerous countries as a general problem. It's not unique to the United States. And that's why I can speak to it at all legally. And I think that the one thing that people very often fail to grasp, especially in systems like the United States that are winner take all and two-party structures, is they confuse lesser evil voting with lesser evil thinking. They make a perfectly sound argument for what you should do in 5 seconds of your life every 2 or 4 years, and conflate that with how you should think and who you should listen to and what you should believe and what you should demand and what you should get active around every day of your life, for all the years in between those 5 seconds. And it's a serious, serious problem. And not only is it identifying with and falling in line with only talking about the things that your leader wants you to talk about, that your supposedly public servant has reversed everything and made you the servant and wants you to talk about, but it's developing animosity, not just for what you've determined is the greater evil of the two teams of elite politicians and their owners and their corporate masters, but it's for all the people who've decided to vote for and identify with that other team, which is, just as almost nobody in Russia wants a war with the United States, and almost nobody in the United States wants a war with Russia, but people in the Russian government and people in the US government are dying for a war. You have to be able to make that distinction. Just as people in the United States have benefited for so many years from the wisdom of so many people around the world, making a distinction between the US public and the US government, you have to come to terms with the fact that the problem is not children stupidly identifying with some party that you've chosen not to identify with. It's the party, it's the politicians, and it's not just the ones on the other team. It's all of them. You have a choice in most of these Western countries now between a war party and a war party, and there are distinctions to be drawn on important matters between these two parties, but there's not a good one. There's not one that cares about you. There's not one that benefits you. There's not one that you should identify with. There's one you can vote for. There's one you could tell other people to vote for. But the notion that that's a really important part of activism is absolutely absurd. We have changed the world vastly more through all the other wonderful tools of nonviolent activism than through voting. Yes, please, very quickly.
Okay, I just wanted to say more allies to Medea's question about more allies could be the 9/11 truth groups who all think that October 7th was a false flag, like 9/11, and which means that the Gaza war was totally unjustified. It was done on purpose. And also the financial channels like Gregory Mannarino, who always talks about how the wars are only made to benefit the bankers. That would be a good ally too.
We can wrap up there. We thank so much for everyone for asking questions, for participating, for listening and joining in this movement for a world beyond war. It is possible, it is within our reach, and it will happen. So we'll pass back over to you, Greta. I think we're going into a short break right now, if I'm not mistaken. Thank you so much to David for all your wonderful expertise, your sharing, your presenting, your hope, and your action for a better world for all of us. All right, thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you, Jessica, so much for moderating. Thank you, David. And yes, we will have a 15-minute break now until 3 p.m. Eastern time, or whatever time zone that is for you, 15 minutes roughly. So feel free for those on Zoom to step away, get some water, food, whatever you need to do. And those in the room, I know you should have some snacks and drinks there. And then we'll come back at approximately 3 p.m. Eastern time for session 2. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Greta. I appreciate it, and welcome everyone to World Beyond War's amazing conference where we bring people together to try to change the world. We can do this. So it is my honor today to bring together these 3 wonderful panelists, Jared Hayes with the Environmental Working Group, and Kazuyuki Nakazato, the director of the Okinawa prefectural government, and Megan Russell is not our enemy. It's not. So I would like to thank them for their cooperation and their programs today. And I'll kick it off first with Jared. And Jared and I have had quite a bit to do with each other over the last several years. Jared is somewhat obsessed with dots. Jared puts dots on maps. They're blue dots, light blue dots, pink dots, orange dots, all different types of dots. And then he connects the dots. And the dots have to do with per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. Damn. PFAS. PFAS. And so Jerry is going to talk about his work, not just on PFAS, but his work at the Environmental Working Group, tracking this kind of contamination and how it relates to bases across the United States. And then it's up to us to figure out a way to use the information that Jared gives us in figuring out how to go about closing these bases. So Jared, thank you so much for being here, pal.
Of course. Happy to be here. Well, thank you for that introduction, Pat. Again, my name is Jared Hayes. I'm the Senior Policy Analyst at the Environmental Working Group, or EWG. Over the last 30 years, EWG worked to investigate toxic chemicals in our environment and how we're exposed to them. And as many here are aware, or are about to become aware, our hundreds of military bases, both here in the US and abroad, are a significant source of exposure to toxins to their many neighboring communities. One of those toxins, as Pat said, and that we've had a history of investigating is PFAS, or commonly referred to as forever chemicals. So what is PFAS? Substances of man-made they remain in our bodies for years. They have been used in a wide variety of different commercial and consumer products. In fact, the CDC has detected PFAS in the blood of 99% of Americans, including newborn babies. And the more that we study this, the more that we study this entire family of chemicals, the more that we understand just how dangerous they are. And PFAS have been linked to cancer, reproductive harm, immune system damage, and other serious health problems, even at very low levels. So they were first commercialized in the 50s and 60s and can be found in everything from paint and paper, personal care products, food packaging, even the clothing that we're wearing right now. And two of the most common ones are PFOA, which was used in DuPont's Teflon, and PFOS, which was used in 3M's Scotchgard. Both of those chemicals within the family of PFAS have been used in firefighting foams that have been used across airports and military bases across the world, and also particularly here in the US. And for decades, DuPont and 3M hid these health harms both from regulators, workers, and their neighboring communities.
Sorry, Jared, to interrupt you. We're getting a few comments here, especially from our interpreters, to please speak a little bit louder and a little bit slower for the interpreters. Thank you.
Can do, thank you.
And please also
well,
let us know when we should switch slides, because I'll wait for you. Thanks.
Will do. So the EPA has known about the risks of PFAS since about the 1990s, but it wasn't until the last few years, it wasn't until the last few years that we've had significant steps forward in addressing this crisis, including setting a drinking water standard just this year. Sure. However, one of the largest sources of PFAS contamination across the country is from Department of Defense installations, where PFAS is widespread and can be found at extremely high levels. Next slide, please. Next, okay, sure. So as Pat mentioned, we like to put dots on maps, and particularly tracking contamination at bases across the US. PFAS has so far been detected at more than 600 military installations, and with 100 more suspected of contamination. EWG has developed a map to track this testing, and we update it regularly with those results for community members to be able to reference, as this typically not as public information or not easy to find. One of the major sources of PFAS contamination across military bases is firefighting foam known as AFFF. It was first developed by the Navy in the 1960s and was used to put out airplane and gasoline fires. But it's been required to be used for decades since that time. And just last year, a review of more than 275 of these bases has found that 90% of them have contaminated groundwater that is used as a drinking water source by nearby communities. And PFAS, once it enters into the water, is highly mobile, meaning that the longer that we take to mitigate the spread, the farther it will go. Next slide, please. Military bases across the US have some of the highest detections of PFAS chemicals found in the environment anywhere in the world, with over a dozen military sites having detections in the millions of parts per trillion, some of which can be seen here on this list, such as England Air Force Base in Louisiana, Myrtle Beach Air Force Base in South Carolina, Plattsburgh Air Force Base in New York. And to put some of these levels into context, I mentioned earlier that a drinking water level was set last year. The drinking water level for just two of those chemicals was 4 parts per trillion. And so there are hundreds of military bases that have detections that are orders of magnitude higher than what is considered to be safe for exposure. Next slide, please. And sadly, like the companies that first developed these chemicals, the military has known for decades that they are toxic. In the 1970s, they figured out that it was toxic. In the 1980s, the military found out that they should be managing their waste better. They didn't. By the 2000s, they learned that it was bioaccumulating in people's blood. And it wasn't until 2011 that they even alerted service members that they could be harmed by this chemical. In 2021, an Inspector General report showed that the DoD officials did not take proactive measures to mitigate this contamination crisis. In short, the Department of Defense has known for decades that the chemicals that they've been using and releasing into the environment across the world was toxic. They've delayed addressing the problem. They've exposed hundreds of thousands of service members and their families and neighboring communities. And now they have a massive inventory of contaminated sites that's going to take decades to clean up. Next slide, please. So 2 years ago in 2022, the department released a health study, and this looked at PFAS exposure of service members. Unfortunately, the report vastly understates the problem and was incorrect based on data that was available by the time it was published. They left out contaminated bases, they used outdated health advisory levels, they only counted people living on the base currently and didn't look at people who had lived or on or near those bases in the past. And disturbingly, they didn't even look at, or they refused to look at studies on the PFAS effects on pregnant women, even though more than 13,000 service members give birth every year. Next slide. So unfortunately, and sadly, toxic contamination does not end at the baseline. Hundreds, if not thousands, of private wells have been contaminated by nearby military bases. While we know that for sure that several dozen have contaminated nearby wells, that's just because we haven't tested them all. Many communities have had to fight for clean water and continue to fight. In Tucson, Arizona, the Air Force contaminated local city drinking water supplies, and some of the hardest hit areas have been environmental justice communities that are already overburdened by toxic contaminants. And in Tucson, the Air Force is even pushing back against US EPA orders to assist the local utilities in cleaning up this problem. Many other communities just don't know about the issue or simply lack the resources to be able to address it. We at EWG are working to connect communities that live near these contaminated bases to provide them with resources and research and help communities share their experiences so they can better represent themselves and advocate with their elected leaders. But it's going to take efforts on the ground and building pressure with policymakers to make this work happen. And the longer that we take, the more it spreads and the more communities are going to be harmed. Next slide. And unfortunately, we are a very long way from up. On the chart on the screen, we can see the cleanup process that the Department of Defense is using. All of the sites with PFAS contamination are in just the first 2 stages circled in red. These are the stages where they study the scope and scale of contamination, not doing actual cleanup. And under each stage, it also lists the estimated number of years, but unfortunately for bases dealing with PFAS, it takes significantly longer, leaving communities wait a year for cleanup to start. And the department estimates that they're not even going to finish those first 2 stages until 2029 or beyond. In fact, Camp Lejeune in North Carolina says they won't finish their second stage until 2048, more than 2 decades from now. And that's before actual cleanup begins. However, the DoD does have tools and things that they can do right now to address the problem. They can start small cleanup projects to address the contamination and stop the spread. And communities that are faced with contamination should be pushing the department for these cleanup actions to start right now and not 50 years from now. But unfortunately, they've only carried out these cleanup actions at a few dozen bases, but out of the hundreds that are going to be needed. Next slide, please. Says a party. Even though they say that they are not, and the numbers don't lie. Since 2016, the Department of Defense has estimated that the cost to complete all of their environmental cleanups has risen by more than $20 billion. It currently stands at 43 billion, which was a jump of 60% over the last 8 years. And that increase is largely due to PFAS chemicals. And to make matters worse, those estimates don't even come close to what's actually going to end up costing. As we continue to study, we continue to understand the full scope of contamination. Unfortunately, the department's annual budget requests do not reflect this massive increase in cost burden. Their cleanup requests have been completely flat. They don't even match inflation. Their budget request for this coming year, 2025, is lower than 2013's request, which was before they even began investigating. And frankly, Congress has been stepping up and providing a little bit more money here and there, but that's thanks to community members and activists impressing on their elected leaders that this is a problem and it needs to be addressed now so that they are stopped being poisoned. This is really for advocates to speak out and to speak up and keep the pressure going year after year, because the longer that we take, the farther it spreads and the more that it will cost. Next slide. So we have a long way to go, but it's the strength and the impact of local community advocates that is needed to keep the pressure up and make sure that we are addressing this crisis right now and we are start cleaning this up. And it's not going to last until our children's generation. If you'd like any of the resources that I mentioned today or any other things that we have, please feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is on the slide. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Jared. So I just wanted to follow up what Jared gave us with just a couple questions, and I'll do that with the other panelists as well before we open it up to others. But Jared, you mentioned when you were talking about the CERCLA process, that is the Superfund process, that you know, the cleanup that is involved with PFAS chemicals, the cleanup by the DOD. Yet many think that it just may not ever be cleaned up, that these forever chemicals have permeated the subsoils like a giant subterranean sponge, and that cleanup is elusive at best. So I just wanted you to comment on that. Yeah, go ahead. Comment on it, Jared.
I mean, that's a fair point to make, is that because these chemicals have been used in so much of our everyday lives or in commercial and consumer products, it's hard to get away from them. They are forever chemicals. They don't break down. But at least we can work on lowering them and not have it in the millions of parts per trillion. And yeah, that cleanup needs to happen regardless.
Absolutely. You do amazingly important work, as does the Environmental Working Group. So I think this nation and the world owes a tremendous debt of gratitude to the Environmental Working Group. But I also wanted to bring up a point that you made several times about drinking water and PFAS in drinking water. And we know from science, especially the European Food Safety Authority, that guesstimates through several studies that PFAS makes up 86% of the PFAS in our blood is from food and especially fish. And I see in your presentation, it's mostly about drinking water. So I wanted you to comment on that as well. Thanks.
Yeah, a lot of our focus has been on drinking water just because it is some of the most universal ways that people are exposed. While we do get a large portion of our PFAS exposure from food, we are consuming so much more water. And so it is a consistent, everyday, constant exposure. And it is something that we can track a little bit better. And once we are able to track contamination, we can start addressing it. It's a little bit harder to track it in food and that exposure levels, because a lot of the food exposure tends to come either from exposure that animals had out in the field or in the water, but it can also come from our food packaging and it just leaching into the food. And so when we test the food, it doesn't quite equate. So water we're able to track better and we're able to address more.
Yeah, thanks for that. I just wanted to point out too that about 8 miles south of here, where Piscataway Creek empties into the Potomac River, we found that largemouth bass contain 94,200 parts per trillion in their fillet. And we tested apartment buildings that had been supplied by the Washington Suburban Sanitary Commissions and found that 55 annulates totaled 1.2 parts per trillion in the drinking water. So it showed us, at least in this region, the drinking water is not so much a problem. Apparently somebody at WSSC is doing a good job. It's more the fish. Yeah. And so thanks, Jared. I appreciate your work. It is absolutely invaluable. And he's made me look so good. I'll get these requests from people and I'll give them an answer in like a minute and a half, citing his work. So
We love to be a resource.
yeah, you are a great one. Okay, I want to switch our attention now to Kazuyuki Nakazato, and he goes by Kaz. And you know, Okinawa has a really unique office in Washington D.C. It's unlike any other office, really. Japan has states. We don't call them states. We call them prefectures. And Okinawa is one of the Japanese prefectures. And unlike the other prefectures in Japan, Okinawa has its own office here in Washington. And they use that office brilliantly to lobby members of Congress and to approach the American public about the unjust military presence, American military presence on the island of Okinawa. And so I think it's brilliant that Kaz is with us today. Thanks, pal.
Thank you.
Yeah, man.
Okay. Haisai. Haisai means hello in Okinawa language. First, I would like to thank World Beyond War for inviting me to this conference, wonderful conference. Pat, thank you for very much introduction. My name is Kazuyuki Nakazato, Kaz Nakazato, and I serve as the director of Okinawa Prefecture DC office. It is great honor for me to introduce Okinawa and discuss the environmental impact of U.S. military bases on the daily lives of Okinawans. Can you pull up my slides?
Give us one moment. We'll pull up the slides. Thank you.
Okay. So,
And if you can speak
first,
any
please
bit
allow me-
louder,
Okay.
or if the
Okay.
volume on the microphone can be increased.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so first, please allow me to briefly introduce my office. Established in 2015, our office has been fostering dialogue between Okinawa and the United States on a wide range of topics, including the presence of US bases in Okinawa. We also play a role in accurately conveying the position of a prefecture government on various matters to the US government, Congress, think tanks, scholars, and other institutions and communities. In addition to our daily discussions with stakeholders, our activities include organizing visits by the governor to DC and other US cities, as well as planning and hosting symposium, webinar, and more. Through these efforts, we aim to deepen mutual understanding of these issues and develop better solutions through collaborative discussions. So that's why today's discussion is very important to us and the people of Okinawa. Next slide, please. I think many of the participants may already know about Okinawa, but allow me to quickly introduce it. So Okinawa is located in the southernmost tip of Japan, lying in the center of East Asia. The population is approximately 1.45 million. The prefecture consists of 160 islands, 47 of which are inhabited, stretching 620 miles from east to west and 250 miles from north to south. Okinawa is home to the only subtropical climate found in Japan. Next slide, please. When we think about current situation of Okinawa in the context of regional security, as well as the policies and activities of our government, it is important to understand the unique history of Okinawa. Before Okinawa was Japanese prefecture, it was an independent state called the Ryukyu Kingdom. We call it Ryuchu Kingdom. From the 15th to 19th century for close to 450 years. It prospered as the hub of maritime trade in East and Southeast Asia and was known as the bridge between nations. Next slide, please. In 1879, the Ryukyu Kingdom was incorporated into Japan and became Okinawa Prefecture. During World War II, from April to June 1945, Okinawa became the site of intense ground battles between Japanese and American forces. Many innocent civilians were caught in the fighting during this devastating conflict, in which over 200,000 lives were lost, including people on both sides. And 1 in every 4 Okinawans were killed, which is about 94,000 civilians, making it a devastating experience for people of Okinawa. So our strong desire for peace is deeply rooted in this experience. After 27 years of American rule after the war, Okinawa was returned to Japan in 1972. Next slide, please. Through commerce and interaction with our neighbors, the people of Okinawa created unique and original culture by absorbing and adapting various and diverse influences. We often call our culture the Champuru culture, which is mixed culture. And Okinawa is also known for its high concentration of centenarians. It is one of the 5 blue zones of longevity in the world. And I think the environment of Okinawa has a lot to do with this. So the island, next please, next slide please. So the island of Okinawa are known for their beautiful beach resorts and abundant nature, such as coral reefs and unique wildlife. In 2021, UNESCO announced the addition of natural sites in Okinawa and the neighboring islands to the World Heritage List in recognition of their high biodiversity value. Next slide, please. So now let's look at Okinawa today. In Okinawa, there are 31 military installations exclusively used by the US military, which is approximately 71 square miles, which is slightly larger than Washington, D.C., 68 square miles. So this means that 70%, more than 70% of all the US exclusive military bases in Japan are concentrated in Okinawa, a small prefecture that accounts for merely 0.6% of the total landmass of Japan. These bases are first built during US military occupation using land requisitioned while the residents were in internment camps. And then after residents returned, more land was seized to expand bases. The process is often referred as bayonets and bulldozers due to its coercive nature. So the slide that just you saw, which was a Futenma Air Station, or Mariko Air Station, occupies approximately 1/4 of the area of the Ginowan city, local city, and it is surrounded by about 100,000 residents. Within this area, there are 10 elementary schools, 5 junior high schools, 4 senior high schools, and 1 university, along with numerous public facilities, including the city hall and hospitals. So, but the impact of the US military presence is not just a statistic. it is a daily reality for Okinawans. Because of the large US military presence on these small islands, we have seen numerous problems stemming from the military bases, and Okinawans have long been calling for the reduction of US military presence on Okinawa. These problems include noise pollution caused by US military aircraft, incidents caused by service members, and environmental pollution, to name just a few. In between the reversion in 1972 and the end of last year, 2023, there have been 586 felonious crimes such as murder, robbery, and rape. Since the end of last year and into this year, a series of sexual assault incidents involving US military personnel have come to light. In addition, a lack of communication between Japan, US authorities, and the Okinawa prefectural government has been revealed, reigniting the anger of Okinawan people. Next slide, please. In between 1972 and the end of last year, there have been 910 aircraft-related incidents. Recent examples include the crash of Marine Corps helicopter at Okinawa International University in Ginowan City in 2004, the Osprey crash off the coast of Aha in Nago City in 2016, and the incident in 2017 where a helicopter window frame fell onto the playground of Tenma Daini Elementary School in Ginowan City during a children's PE class. These incidents continue to threaten the safety and well-being of Okinawan residents. Next, so in vicinity of the Marine Corps Tenma Air Station and Air Force Kadena Air Base, residents are constantly affected by aircraft noises and exhaust fumes due to day and night training conducted not only by stationed aircraft, but also visiting ones. These activities have caused adverse effects on residents' health and overall well-being. Furthermore, in recent years, PFOS, a type of PFAS and other compounds, which are subject to international regulation, have been detected in rivers and groundwater near the bases, raising serious concerns. Okinawa Prefecture conducts water quality tests on rivers and wells around the bases. The results constantly show higher PFOS contaminations location downstream of the bases than at the points upstream. We believe this indicates a high likelihood of contamination originating from the bases, prompting requests for on-site inspections. Such inspections, however, of US bases require agreement from the Japan-US Joint Committee under the Status Forces Agreement, SOA, but permission has not been yet granted. Another focal issue in Okinawa concerning the US military bases is the Tenma Air Station and its planned relocation to Henoko in the northern part of the island, very environment rich area. Despite all the concerns and arguments, adequate discussion have not apparently taken place between the two governments, and therefore we are suggesting or demanding that they take a moment to reconsider the current plan. There are many reasons why we think that Japan and the United States should reconsider the current relocation plan. Uncertainty of construction cost and period, technical difficulties, risk of fault lines, changing security environment in the Indo-Pacific and military's operation standards, repair and maintenance costs, concerns, etc. And high biodiversity of the water of Henoko. The waters of Henoko are home to more than 5,300 kinds of creatures, including 262 endangered species like dugongs. The Okinawan people have expressed their opposition to the relocation plan on many occasions, 3 gubernatorial elections and the prefectural referendum. The biodiversity-rich natural environment of Okinawa is treasure and resource for the prefecture, and its value and need for protection are recognized internationally. However, the presence of the US military poses a significant threat. Civil society is working with international NGOs and institutions to eliminate these threats and protect the environment. Today, I would like to introduce some of their works. Again, as I mentioned, the construction of the US military base at Henoko and Oura Bay will not only destroy a sea-rich biodiversity, but also raise feasibility concerns due to the soft seabed. Okinawan civil society has urged the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN, to issue 3 recommendations on the protection of the dugongs inhabiting Henoko and Oura Bay. In 2019, IUCN
as critically endangered in its this and expressed concerns about the impact of the new base construction.
Oh, the volume changed 1 second. You were perfectly clear and now it's muffled.
Okay. Furthermore, the dugongs
It's still very muffled. I'm sorry, Kaz, if you could pause for a second until the volume can be restored.
Furthermore, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, we've just lost the video though.
Okay.
There, yay.
Can you
Thank
hear
you.
me?
Yes.
It's okay? Okay. So furthermore, the Dugong status report by the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, and the Convention of Migratory Species, CMS, will be published soon. It also highlights the significant impact of the new base construction on the Okinawa dugongs. In the United States, a lawsuit was filed against Department of Defense regarding the dugong issue known as the dugong lawsuit. Another challenge is protecting the forest of Okinawa. The UNESCO World Natural Heritage Site, Yambaru Forest, in northern Okinawa Island is adjacent to the US military northern training area, raising significant concerns about the impact of flight training, jungle training, and military waste left within the World Heritage Site on valuable and endangered species. In cooperation with the NGO World Heritage Watch, based on in Bonn, Germany, Okinawa civil society has been providing information to UNESCO and IUCN. They are preparing an official request to UNESCO to investigate US military training and waste issues. Capitalizing Okinawa's distinctive geological and historical context, Okinawa Prefecture is actively working toward establishing itself as a hub for peacebuilding. By furthering international exchanges and cooperation in various domains, the Okinawa Prefecture government is fortifying its framework and policies as a form of subnational diplomacy that complements diplomacy at the national level. Okinawa Prefecture aims to become bridge of nations in 21st century, contributing to stability and prosperity, just as it did during the era of the Ryukyu Kingdom. We are now strengthening the regional bilateral and multilateral ties. The governor just visited Washington and New York earlier this month to update policymakers and security experts on Okinawa's US military base issues and the views of the people of Okinawa on regional security. There, the governor emphasized that importance of engaging in peaceful dialogue and diplomacy instead of solely relying on military deterrence. Okinawa Prefecture government will continue to strengthen our efforts to facilitate dialogue between regional players to create and sustain peace. Based on lessons learned from our tragic war experiences, we look forward to creating a peaceful and abundant Okinawa through the spirit of carving new era, global exchange, and mutual support. I hope we can extend our networks and work closely together, building a peaceful and prosperous Okinawa by sharing new ideas and cooperation will lead to stability and prosperity in the Asia-Pacific region and the world. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward for further discussion.
Thank you so much, Kaz. And so on behalf of the people of the United States, especially the peace-loving people of the United States, I apologize for the crimes committed by my government. I heard you say that the governor is relying on dialogue and diplomacy, and I applaud that and have seen that with Governor Tamaki as well as 2 weeks ago. But when I and others press the Okinawan prefecture, we find a hesitance to call out the United States in terms of demanding closure of bases. And I understand the difficult situation, and I think Megan will help us see that more clearly too, regarding relations between the United States and Japan and China. But it's tough for you, I think. But can you address that for this crowd, the reluctance of the governor to call for a complete withdrawal of U.S. bases?
So when the Okinawa was returned to Japan in 1972, the wish of Okinawan people to go back to the pre-war era, where there are no bases or military bases. And that spirit, I think, is still within Okinawa. But realistically, still we have, again, more than 70% of U.S. military bases on the island, and we have to improve the situation step by step. So governor is trying, even though he thinks that no base is the ideal, but he wants to see step by step closure of U.S. military bases. So right now his policy is to reduce those 70% to at least like 50% first, then move on from there. So, but still, we think that walk through the dialogue and discussion, we can make these things better for the Okinawan people.
I deeply appreciate that. 2 weeks ago, I was with the governor and Peter Kuznick. Peter Kuznick, of course, is a great American author and peacemaker. And Peter pulled me aside and said, you know, Denny Tamaki and the Okinawan prefecture are our allies. And you know, you press too hard, you may find them replaced by people that, you know, are half the peacemaker of Denny Tamaki. So it is refreshing to hear and to witness that the prefecture is truly exploring avenues of dialogue and diplomacy. So thank you, Kaz. Okay, now I'd like to switch things over to Megan Russell. And Megan Russell is a peacemaker in her own right. She works with Code Pink, and I understand she's earned a master's in economics from the London School of International Studies. Is that correct?
Master's in Conflict Studies from the London School of Economics.
There you go. Hey, I was close, but that's why I looked at you, you know? So Megan brings a lot to this study, and you'll see there was a rationale here. We began with the PFAS, and then we saw, you know, the talk by Kaz on Okinawa. Now we'll see it come into focus regarding the overall geopolitical situation involving China. And I hear you think that we should be friends with China?
Yes, I
Okay.
do.
Take it away.
Hot take. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you, Pat, for moderating, and thank you to Jared and Kaz for your contributions. And thank you to World Beyond War for the invitation to speak today and for creating this space for us virtually in person to discuss these topics. My name is Megan Russell. I am the campaign coordinator of Code Pink's China is Not Our Enemy campaign. And we advocate against war with China, for mutual cooperation, and for the reallocation of resources away from U.S. military buildup across the Asia Pacific and instead towards other important issues like environmental cooperation and nuclear disarmament. So today I'm going to talk about some of the issues I've worked on related to the harmful effects of U.S. military bases in the Asia Pacific, and I'm also going to talk about the link between the anti-war movement and the environmental justice movement, why it's so important to build and foster connections across these spaces. Next slide, please. So first, the anti-war movement is at the very root of it, a battle for life. War destroys not just people, but also the planet. War only takes life away, it does not give it. And in order for both to thrive, people in the environment need to have a balanced, symbiotic relationship. And because of that, I believe any and all contributions to the anti-war movement are also supportive of the environmental justice movement. The mission's ultimately the same. So I have some very brief statistics of the overall impact of U.S. military on the environment. The U.S. Department of Defense put out more than 50 million metric tons of greenhouse gases in 2021, which is basically the equivalent, more than the equivalent, in fact, of the emissions of entire countries in Europe and elsewhere. That makes the environmental footprint of the U.S. military equivalent to that of an entire country and more than quite a few of them. If it was its own nation state, the Department of Defense would be number 47 on the list of highest greenhouse gas emitters. And another statistic from 2001 to 2017, the total emissions of the US military added up to more than 1.2 billion metric tons, which comes from a Watson Institute report. And the equivalent of that is about 260 million passenger vehicles, which is over twice as many that are being driven around in the US alone. And that's not including the past 8 years in which defense spending has been consistently on the rise. So the US military is so vast and globalized that it has a carbon footprint larger than any other institution on Earth. The US military is in itself an environmental disaster, and not just because of its carbon footprint, but also because of the damages it inflicts on the environment in 1,000 other ways, through military bases, war exercises, chemical spills, nuclear testing, damage to protected reefs and wildlife, and the list goes on. So today we're looking specifically at military bases. So let's get into that. Next slide, please. Oh, I think the one before. The one with the map. So the US has over 900 military bases across the world. You've probably been hearing that number a lot these past few days. And as you can see, a large number of troops are stationed in Japan and South Korea across the Asia Pacific, partially due to holdover from World War II, the Korean-Vietnam War, but mainly due to the
the geopolitical interests of the US in stationing as many troops as possible around China. So we focus a lot of our attention on the Asia Pacific region because of its relevance to the campaign, because US military buildup is justified as being deterrence against China. And there have been many issues, unsurprisingly, with US militarism in the region, including environmental harm, human rights abuses, tension flare-ups. And I'd like to talk about one case specifically more in depth, the Philippines. Next slide, please. So going back a little, the photo to the right is the Subic Naval Base, which is located 120 kilometers north of Manila. And below that is the Clark Air Force Base. Both bases were shut down in the 90s, ending nearly a century of US military presence in the country. And just a brief background, the US had occupied the Philippines for 48 years, from 1898 after the Spanish-American War to 1946, which was contested briefly by Japan during World War II before the US granted its independence in 1946. Yeah, so now when the US pulled out of both bases, it reported that no toxic materials had been left behind, which was, of course, discovered to be false. Not only did the US leave behind an environmental disaster, but it soon became obvious that many of its practices, while the bases were still up and running, had been causing massive ecological harm that continues to affect local communities even to this day. Navy documents revealed that the Subic base generated over 500 tons of hazardous waste in just the 2 years before it closed, and only about 20% of that had been safely disposed of. Only 25% of all generated sewage was treated daily, and most waste was discharged directly into the bay. Lead and other heavy metals were drained directly into the bay or buried as a landfill, which is in direct violation of US standards, which requires these sorts of metals to be disposed of as hazardous waste. The power plant at the base also contained pollutants such as polychlorinated biphenyl, PCB, and admitted these pollutants directly into the air, which was also in direct violation of US clean air standards. Benzene and other toxic chemicals were found in soil and water around rice farmlands and irrigation streams due to leaks in the 42-mile pipeline between the two bases. There was also many reports of sexual violence towards local women by US soldiers and widespread exploitation of young women and girls in nearby cities such as Olongapo, which is common everywhere that you find US military bases, as the colonization and desecration of women's bodies and land are eternally linked to one another. And just for note, they estimate the cleanup of the base would be a lot higher than $1 billion if they had bothered to do anything. Next slide, please. So when you harm the environment, you also harm the people that live there. And this became true for the communities around Subic and Clark. There became an unusually high incidence of birth defects and impaired intelligence among local children. There was a sharp increase in kidney disease, reported cases of lung illness among local shipyard workers. Air pollutants that had been released by the Subic power plant have been directly correlated to an increased risk of cancer, fertility problems, and neurological defects. And thousands of people became sick with these toxic-related diseases like leukemia and cerebral palsy, heart disease, and hundreds more died. One mother, for example, lost her 4-year-old son to stage 3 bone marrow cancer, which doctors blamed on exposure to carcinogenic contaminants. And this mother had made frequent trips to a beach near Subic Bay throughout her pregnancy. So for these sorts of consequences, it's extremely difficult to make the direct connection. You have the data, the before and after, the increase in disease and death, but it's really an uphill battle to make the argument legally. And so a lot of times these deaths are brushed aside or never directly linked to the US in any real legal capacity. Next slide, please. So what was done. The Navy and the U.S. Embassy in Manila, of course, denied leaving any serious toxic waste behind. They claimed the U.S. complied with all Philippine environmental laws and were not required to adhere to U.S. regulations and standards. And the agreement between the Philippines and the U.S. stipulated that the U.S. was not obligated to return relinquished facilities to their original condition, which was in legal terms justification for the U.S. not needing to clean up after itself. So activists disputed the claim. In 2000, a group of people filed a class action lawsuit against the U.S. and Filipino government, claiming damage for health complications and death, but it was not successful. They weren't ultimately able to hold the U.S. legally accountable at all. It instead became an argument of moral responsibility, of which our Defense Department duly lacks. So it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to hold the U.S. legally responsible for these sorts of environmental crimes. And because of that, a lot of the battle comes down to making sure it doesn't happen again. And U.S. behavior has not improved over the years. In 2012, during a war exercise in Subic Bay, a U.S. naval ship dumped about 200,000 liters of waste and 800 liters of oil and grease into the water. And this, like many other incidences like it, was covered up. So next slide, please. So looking forward, since the Obama administration's pivot to Asia, there has been increased interest in remilitarizing the Philippines because of its proximity to China. Obama negotiated the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement in 2014, paving the way for the largest U.S. military presence in the country since the two bases were shut down. Essentially, it allows the U.S. to allocate funds to improve and construct facilities within existing Philippine military bases, as well as to deploy American troops there on a rotational basis. And last year, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin helped negotiate another 4 bases that are more accessible to the South China Sea in the north. Now, this is spoken of as if the U.S. is being granted access to already existing Philippine military bases, but what it really is constructing a bunch of new infrastructure for specifically for the U.S. military in these areas. And just last week at a congressional hearing with the Foreign Affairs Committee, Deputy Secretary Kurt Campbell, who's all about military expansion, was cheering on the 4 new bases. And one of the congressmen praised Campbell and asked him semi-rhetorically, "Now, when's the last time we had a military base in the Philippines?" And Campbell smiled and said, "It's been a long time." So to them, it's no different than the U.S. having its own military bases in the Philippines for the first time since 1991. And that's how they're celebrating it. And I'd also like to note that Campbell told the committee that the most important thing to do in the next 10 years was to increase funding and expand our Navy in the region. And this all comes in conjunction with recent legislation, the Philippine Enhanced Resilience Act, which will provide another $2.5 billion in military funding to the Philippines over the next 5 years. So that was introduced and shared with the Committee on Foreign Relations. And we've taken that up as something to go against. And that's not including the $500 million that Blinken and Austin brought over last month. And since 2015, they have given over $1 billion in military financing to the Philippines. So this bill would really be a major acceleration of that. Next slide, please. So we have a campaign at Code Pink called War is Not Green that specifically looks at the environmental impacts of everything to do with war. In fact, the campaign's leading actions all week in New York City under a designated climate week, including shutting down Citibank, a climate march, a gathering for the elimination of nuclear weapons, and so on. And our demands include things like defund the Pentagon, divest from the war machine, and it's a combination of educating our audience on the environmental impacts of war, as well as staging actions and spreading our message as far as it can go. So I personally believe that the environmental approach to countering U.S. militarism provides one of the strongest arguments. As one of the main stories our government tells us to condone its military expansion is that it needs to protect the world from this enemy or that enemy. But in this case, the true enemy is climate change. And, you know, climate change is an existential threat to all nations and to all people. And there's really nothing that I think brings people together like sharing an enemy. But the difficult part is overcoming the hurdles that challenge that narrative, the disbelief for one, the war economy for another. And in the case of military bases, it gets trickier because it means holding the US accountable for its environmental crimes, which it's certainly good at erasing, or trying to impede future funding, which becomes difficult in the face of fear and paranoia over the US's newest enemy, which in this case is China. So we're really at a pivotal moment here. Our government is majorly increasing its spending and operations in the Asia Pacific because they want to be ready for war with China by 2027. In fact, the US Navy just released its official plan last week to be ready by 2027. So it's more important than ever to be talking about these issues and informing people and doing whatever you can to oppose US plans for military expansion and conflict escalation with China. So with that, you can learn more about our War is Not Green campaign at codepink.org/wing, or learn more about our China is Not Our Enemy campaign at codepink.org/China. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Megan. That was an amazing report. You mentioned that, you know, in the Philippines, you have an outbreak of leukemia and cerebral palsy and heart disease and kidney disease and lung disease. And then you mentioned various contaminants, including PCBs and benzene. And we also know trichloroethylene and PFAS are present in the Philippines as well. Speak a little bit about connecting the dots. You know, you mentioned how important it is to draw in, you know, the environment into overall anti-war work. Well, connecting the dots between individual contaminants and the specific death and misery and disease and cancers they cause, that, can you speak to that?
Yeah, of course. Well, I think from the outside looking in for all of us, it's really obvious. You know, you look at the data, there's these contaminants that directly lead to these illnesses, and there's a steep increase in these illnesses in this region. Like it's quite easy to connect those dots. Where it becomes a lot more difficult is when you're looking at it from a legal perspective. There's a lot of ways to kind of get around the blame for that. And in the case, you know, from the US, the document itself, the agreement signed by the Philippines and the US stipulated that the US is not to blame, or did not need to clean up after itself, and therefore it was really difficult to raise that to any other level. And that's, you know, why a lot of the work comes down to raising awareness about it and trying to get more funding for cleanup.
It sounds like maybe more dots there for Jared. PCBs and benzene and trichloroethylene and individual diseases associated with these contaminants. But just one more follow-up too, regarding perhaps the frustration attached to your work. And so, you know, when you started rattling off diseases like, again, you know, leukemia and cerebral palsy and kidney and heart and lung diseases, it's the same going on at Fort Ord in California, where we have a database of 1,500 people that have diseases that are directly attributable to the 4 or 5 contaminants that we know are also killing people in the Philippines. Is it frustrating to you? Do you sense any kind of attitude where it's like, well, hell, you know, why worry about the Philippines when you know you got Camp Lejeune and you got Fort Ord and you got several hundred other military bases in the good old USA, huh?
Yeah, certainly. There's quite a lot of frustration among local Filipino people who, for one, are severely affected by this, and who are also really do not want U.S. military presence in their country. They're terrified of, further toxic harm, and they're also terrified of being pulled into a wider conflict between the U.S. and China. And so from the people's standpoint, there's a lot of frustration on this. And really what it's been is, a high level government decision, ignoring, the desires of the people.
Right. And I'm sure Kaz could speak to that as well. I mean, as far as Okinawa is concerned, the frustrations that you have been feeling for the last 2 generations. This is what Megan's talking about. It's the same thing. So I think that wraps up at least this part. Maybe we have a few more minutes. I'll have to defer perhaps to Patrick or Greta.
Yes, we do. We have about, I think we can do 10, 20 minutes or so of Q&A here, and then we'll go to Kathy Kelly. We do have several questions that have come in online. I'm happy to start with one of those. All right. So we have a question from Fatumata, who is our World Beyond War Mali chapter coordinator, who says, and this could be perhaps directed to you, Jared, has any research about PFAS contamination been conducted in Africa as the continent is struggling with US bases?
I'm not currently aware of any specific research of PFAS at military bases in Africa. I can say on an upside that Congress has directed the military to stop using firefighting foams that are made with PFAS, and that will technically begin sometime next year, ideally, if they don't stop delaying it.
Thank you, Jared. Greta?
Should we
Sure.
ask questions in
I
the
can
room or
keep
online?
going. Yeah, we've got a lot here, but also we can go back and forth.
Sure. David?
What would people in Okinawa or in the Philippines or anywhere else, anyone who wants to answer, most like to see people in the United States get off their sofas and do and demand of the US government? I mean, I love demanding that the people of Okinawa do more, but it's the US government. We're supposed to be in charge of it. What would people most like to see the people of the United States be demanding happen immediately?
Thank you for the question. So we are trying to reach out to the members of Congress to look at the situation of in Okinawa, and especially for like PFAS. The U.S. military installation overseas are looked at oversight as the same as the U.S. military bases in the United States. And we understand that we through the conversation with members, and it's frustrating also for people in the United States, and it's kind of moving very slow. But at least I think we would like to see the collaboration and information sharing with also from the government side, but also within those people advocating for the cleanup, or the people who wants to know the situation and make it better. So we would like to see many people in the United States approaching the Congress members for this to think about not only but to all including the military installation overseas, like including Okinawa.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, there's also been some really excellent organizations with chapters in the US and chapters abroad, such as the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines and their coalition partners, Gabriela and Marjan, and other organizations that have been doing a lot of, cross-continental work, actions, rallies, protests, So just like getting involved with that stuff is really great as well.
Thank you.
Yes, I had a question for Kaz and for Megan in terms of the alliances that have been built up with the United States, like Quad. Is this something that there is opposition to within Japan? Do Japanese people see China as an enemy and see these military alliances as somehow protecting them? And then Megan, in the larger, not just the Quad, but also AUKUS, with Australia, these new alliances, the NATO expansion into the Indo-Pacific. How do you see China? Do you see China as countering that, or do you see it as kind of a tit for tat? We'll do this because China did this, and then it kind of just has a never-ending vicious cycle.
So I cannot speak for all the Japanese citizens, but Japanese government is, like United States, trying to increase the spending of the defense spending, like doubling in 5 years the defense spending. And they, the ruling party, LDP, Liberal Democratic Party, thinks that they have the people's backed up this policy. And I think, unfortunately, many people, there are many different opinions, but many people think that China is kind of troublesome. So that, but I think as Okinawan people of Okinawa and Okinawa prefecture government, we think that through the dialogue and building, confidence building and people-to-people exchange makes it change the situation, and in order to increase the tolerance, not increase the tolerance, I think we think the diplomacy, dialogue, and discussion, people-to-people exchange is very important. So I think I think there are many people in Okinawa and in mainland Japan thinks that. So I think we should kind of promote exchange through dialogue.
Yeah, I can certainly say that there's a lot of local people in Japan, Philippines, South Korea that are really worried about being pulled into a larger war between the US and China. They're worried about the partnerships, and the US is providing a lot of weapons to its allies. Like Australia, it's given them nuclear submarines and precision weaponry and all the high-tech technology. And there's also a lot of concern because the US has operational control over the militaries of South Korea, and now after like a recent agreements of Japan's troops as well, which essentially means that if a war was to start, then the US would essentially control the military of these countries and have command over them to do with as they please. And Japanese people, South Korean people, they don't want to go to war with China. China doesn't want to go to war with them either. It's really something everyone wants to avoid. And the creation of these partnerships in the region, the new Asia NATO, it's very much escalating the tensions, as well as the military buildup in the war games is also escalating the tensions. And a lot of people are concerned about all these issues.
We've got a raised hand online. Could we go to Medea online? And now unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, first of all, thank you to all of the panelists because your work is so important. My question is whether you think there's a role for youth to deal with this gigantic issue. It would be like the Children's Crusade. But in New York, in the United States, the group called Our Children's Trust is fighting for a future that includes doing something about the environment. So I don't know whether that would be possible in Okinawa or in the Philippines. I happen to have had the luck to meet Corazon Aquino, who fought and got rid of Subic Bay, at a time, we celebrated it, and it's all been undone now. However, my question is really, what role can we expect children, youth, university people, somewhat akin to what is happening here with the resistance to the genocide in Gaza? And thank you for your work.
So the question was, how can youth and like university students get more involved? Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of possibilities to get involved in the environmental or anti-war movement. I guess specifically for my campaign, the China's Not Our Enemy campaign, a lot of it comes down to, what can we do right now? One of the easiest things you can do is just learn more about it. Kind of try to like open your mind against the war propaganda, the way that our government kind of manipulates and shapes people to support these wars by, labeling this country or that country an enemy that is opposing everything bright and beautiful about the world, which if you look back through history has happened countless times, and always in retrospect is really quite silly. So I think, one of the best things you can do is just commit yourself to learning.
Can I go ahead? Okay, I actually have two questions. I don't know if I should ask them both at the same time or, oh, my name is Gotham. So I'll go ahead with the first one, specifically for Jarrett. For PFAS chemicals, you had talked about cleanup, but do you have specifics on like what cleanup looks like if something is termed a forever chemical? Unless that description itself is a misnomer, how do you clean up something that's forever?
Yeah, that is a really big problem that is being faced right now across the environmental community looking at this chemical because it is forever. But as far as cleanup at specific sites go, we can at least remove it from the environment, isolate it. But putting a filtration system in a landfill is problematic because it just exits the landfill and enters back into the environment, and it creates this terrible waste cycle. And so until we find a proper disposal method, we're really just going to have to work to isolate and remove it from the environment so that people will stop being exposed to it as much as possible. There are some methods of incineration, but even those have great flaws to it, as it can just end up in the air and perpetuate the problem.
All right, thank you for that. Next question for yourself, or I guess anybody, either any panelist or anybody online, with what's going on in Palestine with the bombing in Gaza and now Lebanon, with the amount of bombs that have been dropped and some of the munitions that have been used, some of which have been banned, like white phosphorus, but we've seen it being used anyway. Do you have any data on the effects that has had on the land of Palestine? Because we keep they keep saying that someday these people will be allowed to return to their homes. But my concern is, what are they going to return to other than rubble? I mean, what has been done to the land? Are they even going to be able to grow anything? Is there any information available on that? Or if it's not specific to Gaza and Lebanon, can anybody speak to the effects of such bombs in general on the land, and how long do those effects last?
I can. I guess for starters, I wrote a piece about less than a year ago called Poison in Gaza. It's on militarypoisons.org website. And in that piece, it points out that Israeli Defense Forces knocked out wastewater treatment plants, first of all. And you heard Megan talk about wastewater treatment plants and how, the US didn't, even treat sewage 80% of the time. And so that was the first thing. And so it wasn't just a war in traditional terms where you blow stuff up. You also poison people to death. And so that article has several links to NGOs in Ramallah in the West Bank and in Gaza that you can look up and maybe contact. I think it's important work, and you ask an extraordinarily important question. As far as the crops are concerned, with what we know, they'll be able to grow food. It just that it may poison people.
We have a raised hand here on Zoom, and I know we're almost out of time, and I think you might have one person there up at the mic. So maybe we can do one on Zoom, one at the mic, and then wrap up. Does that sound good?
Yep. How about if we have Diane here, and Diane, if you can make it quickly, and then we can have the one person and we'll wrap up.
Okay, all right, I'll try to make it quick.
I love you, Diane.
There's an expression that to lose a friend is a tragedy, but to lose an enemy is a catastrophe. And my early work was on the image of the enemy in the Soviet in the 80s. And we address that, but so I think we need like demystification, that there's a lot of psychological manipulation of fear and exaggerated threat that we see driving us into every war. But also, isn't your program also studying conflict studies? Yeah. So in terms of that, in addition to that, what about strategies to analyze the underlying conflicts and to reduce tension and things like citizen diplomacy, but also like I've worked with Johan Galtung, like the work on conflict transformation as part of the.
Well, that was a simple question. Diane, Megan, you have 10 seconds.
Thank you for the question. I think subnational diplomacy is really critical because we really can't rely on our government one way or another to decide. Yeah. So people-to-people dialogue is so important. In China, US have a lot of city-to-city programs as well, like city friendship, cities in China that pair with cities in the US, which is really wonderful. And, I always encourage people to learn more about China, about China's history, to travel to China if that's in any way possible. A lot of people are very, very surprised by what they experience while they're in China. It is a personal endeavor as much as anything to take yourself out of the mind frame that we've all been put into through our society and the way that they frame these issues, the way that our government frames these issues to gain support for their intentions overseas, military, economic, political, whatever it may be. Yeah, I don't know. Does that answer your question?
No, but that's okay.
Did I fail?
You failed miserably, Megan. We have one more. Is that it?
Yes,
On
yes.
Zoom? Okay, take it away,
Yes.
Greta.
So, Quanta, you can now unmute.
Thank you very much. I wanted to address the young people. It isn't just about gaining knowledge about the issues that we are dealing with in terms of war and peace, but I think that knowledge has to get into action. And if the youth is able to galvanize and get together and protest like they did with George Floyd, and I think you have to consolidate your power and you have to challenge the legislators who are stealing away resources from your future as well as present. So I do think that knowledge and just personal education is not enough. This is a time for collective action and by the youth that has the wisdom and the energy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Quanta. We appreciate that. And I think, Greta, that pretty much wraps it up, huh?
Yes, thank you so much to all of our panelists, and thank you, Pat, for your energy in moderating this session. And now we want to go to Kathy Kelly, World Beyond War's board president, for some concluding words before we have time for networking. So Kathy, you should be able to unmute.
Well, thank you, Greta. On behalf of the board of World Beyond War, I'd like to extend a very, very earnest thank you to everyone who has participated in this conference, but I really have to thank Greta and Rachel for putting together more and more of a vision of a world Beyond War. You've helped us internationalize. You've helped us become more intergenerational through this conference. And I'm very grateful to all the staff who made it possible as well. And it seems to me like it was a particularly beneficial coincidence, in a sense, that three of the staff people for World Beyond War, Mohammed Abu Nahal in Mysore, India, and Mark Stein in New York, and Bob Fantina in Canada, were able to put finishing touches on the World Beyond War bases map at the same time that this conference was developing the finishing touches to bring us all together. And so to be able to get a better grip on the very terrible tentacles of poisonous militarism can be likened to the monstrous hydra. You cut off one head and a new one appears. And it has certainly seemed that the United States, with its bases all over the world, has contributed steadily to bereavement, to sickening people, causing enormous contamination and pollution, demonizing others at a time when we so particularly need to understand other people's cultures, to build our capacity to collaborate. And, you know, maybe 10 years ago, I think I would have said that the dominant religion in the United States is shopping, but I don't say that anymore. I think the dominant religion in this country where I live is militarism. And this militarism pretends that somehow it is increasing security, whereas in fact, when we think about the greatest threats rationally that we face and that the youth face so acutely, we have to think about nuclear weaponry and nuclear annihilation. We have to think about the ecological collapse. We have to think about the possibility of new pandemics. And militarism certainly doesn't defend us from those threats. It doesn't build security. So I feel deep admiration for all of the participants in this conference, because what I heard as themes again and again had to do with empathy, with trying to identify with the people who are being pushed into poverty, who are being forcibly displaced from their land, who are enduring the agonies that are caused by warfare. And also, we have heard a great deal of hope coming from people who have said, we will find our solidarity with other people all around the world and intergenerationally. We see a student movement which is so inspirational at this point, especially as it exposes the ways in which war profiteers are making huge amounts of money by exacerbating wars and prolonging wars. We see the recognition on the part of so many people of the collaboration that's necessary and possible between environmental movements and the movement to end all wars. And so in a sense, I think this conversion that's called for in order to enable a world beyond war is something that we can all be adherents to, and for the sake of next generations, be passionately committed to. So thank you very much, everyone, for bringing us together. And Greta, I'll turn it back to you for the networking.
Thank you so much, Kathy. So now we will say goodbye to Washington, D.C., and you all have your own time there in the physical space for networking and snacks. And we also have some expo booths there of some of our sponsoring organizations. So goodbye to Washington, D.C. Thank you for day 3. And those who are on Zoom, you are welcome to stay on Zoom for 30 more minutes. We'll have breakout rooms here on Zoom.